Hey y'all, if you remember last time, we were trying to escape, but the borrowers had the ferret that was running around the house trying to find a way in, and they couldn't let it in, but then they couldn't also get out to get away so that the two families could be separate and possibly be able to survive. So anyway, we are on The Borrowers Afloat, so if you guys can grab your copy of that book, like, share, and subscribe. We are on chapter 9. So let's go ahead and get started here. Between the devil and the deep blue sea, that's us, said Pa with a wan smile. He was quoting from Arietti's diary, a proverb book. They sat grouped on the hearth where the stones were warm. The iron shovel, still too hot to sit on, lay sprawled across the ashes. Homily had pulled up the crushed matchbox lid, on which, with her lighter weight, she could sit comfortably. Pod and Arietti perched on a charred stick. With 3 lighted dips there sat between them on the ash. Shadows lay about them in the vast confines of the room, and now that the Henderys were out of earshot, they felt drowned out in spreading silence. After a while, there was a broken by the faint tinkle of a bell. Quite close, it seemed suddenly. There was a slight scratching sound, and the lightest, most delicate of surfaces. They all glanced wide-eyed at the door, which from where they sat was deeply sunk in shadow. "It can't get in, can it?" whispered Homily. "Not a hope," said Pod. "Let it scratch. We're all right here." All the same, Arietti threw a searching glance up the wide chimney. The stones she sought, if the worst came to worst, looked uneven enough to climb. Then suddenly, far, far above her, she saw a square of violet sky, and in it a single star, and for some reason felt reassured. "As I see it," said Pod, "we can't go, and we can't stay." "And that's how I see it," said Homily. "Suppose," suggested Arietti, "we climbed up the chimney onto the thatch." "And then what?" said Pod. "I don't know," said Arietti. "There we'd be," said Pod. "Yes, there we'd be," agreed Homily unhappily. "Even supposing we could climb a chimney, which I doubt." There was a few moments' silence, and then Pod said solemnly, "Homily, there's nothing else for it." "But what?" asked Homily, raising a startled face lit from below. It looked curiously bony, and was streaked here and there with ash, and Arietti, who guessed what was coming, gripped her 2 hands neath her knees and stared fixedly down at the shovel, which lay sideways across the hearth. "But to bury our pride, that's what," said Pod. "How do you mean?" asked Homily weakly, but she knew quite well what he meant. "We got to go, quite open-like, to Loopy and Hendry, and ask them to let us stay." Homily put her thin hands on either side of her thin face and stared at him dumbly. "For the child's sake," Pod pointed out gently. The tragic eyes swiveled round to Arietti and back again. "A few dried peas. That's all we'd ask for," went on Pod very gently. "Just water to drink and a few dried peas." Still Homily did not speak. "And we'd say they could keep get it over with?" Might as well, said Pod. He stood up and put out a hand to Homily. Come on, me old girl, he coaxed her. Homily rose slowly, and Pod turned to Arrietty. Homily's hand pulled under his arm. Standing beside his wife, he drew himself up to his full 6 inches. There's 2 kinds of courage I know of, he said, and your mother's got both of 'em. You make note of that, my girl, when you're writing in your diary. But Arrietty was gazing past him into the room. She was staring white-faced into the shadows beyond the log box toward the scullery door. Something moved, she whispered. Pod turned, following the direction of her eyes. What like? He asked sharply. Something furry. They all froze. Then Homily, with a cry, ran out from between them, amazed and aghast. They watched her scramble off the hearth and run with outstretched arms toward the shadows beyond the long box. She seemed to be laughing or crying, her breath coming out in little gasps. The dear boy, the good boy, the blessed creature! It's Spiller! Cried Arrietty, on a shout of joy. She ran forward too, and they dragged him out of the shadows, pulled him into the hearth and beside their dips, where the light shone warmly on his suit of moleskins, worn now, slightly tattered, and shorter in the leg. His feet were bare and gleaming with black mud. He seemed to have grown heavier and taller. His hair was still as ragged and his pointed face as brown. They did not think to ask him where he had come from. It was enough that he was there. Spiller, it seemed to Arrietty, always materialized out of thin air and dissolved again as swiftly. Oh, Spiller, gasped Homily, who was not surprised to like him. In the nick of time, the very nick of time. And she sat down on the charred stick, which flew up the farther end, scattering a cloud of ash, and burst into happy tears. Nice to see you, Spiller, said Pod, smiling and looking him up and down. Come for your summer clothes? Spiller nodded. Bright-eyed, he gazed about the room, taking in the bundles strapped to the hat pin, and pulled out position of the log box. The old bareness and rearrangements that signify human departure. But he made no comment. Countrymen, such as Spiller and Pod were, do not rush into explanations. Faced with whatever strange evidence, they mind their manners and bide their time. Well, I happen to know they're not ready, Pod went on. She's sewn the vest, mind, but she hasn't joined up the trousers. Spiller nodded again. His eyes sought out Arrietty, who, ashamed of her first outburst, had become suddenly shy and had withdrawn behind the shovel. Well, said Pod at last, looking about as though aware suddenly of strangeness in the surroundings. If you find us in a nice sort of pickle. Movin' house? Asked Spiller casually. In a manner of speaking, said Pod, and as Homily dried her eyes on her apron and began to pin up her hair, he outlined the story to Spiller in a few rather fumbling words. Spiller listened with one eyebrow raised, and his mocking V-shaped mouth twisted up at the corners. This was Spiller's famous expression. Arrietty remembered, no matter what you were telling him. And so, said Pod, shrugging his shoulders, you see how we're placed. Spiller nodded, looking thoughtfully. Must be pretty hungry now, that ferret, Pod went on. Poor creature, can't hunt with a bell. The rabbits hear him coming. Gone in a flash, the rabbits are. But with our short legs, he'd be on us in a trice, bell or no bell. But how did you manage? Pod asked suddenly. The usual, said Spiller. What usual? Spiller jerked his head toward the washhouse. The drain, of course. All right, so after they thought of everything to try and get out, they didn't think of the drain leaving out of the wash house. They had just seen everything combined and had not thought of a way out. That is kind of funny. Love that. Love how that ended and how that kind of built up around there like that. Anyway, hopefully you guys liked this chapter. I know if you've kind of been it's been kind of growing, and it's very, very fun to kind of see how that Mary Norton was able to see these creatures 6 inches or shorter and be able to create a whole world for them. It's so amazing. Anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me on this journey today. And let's see how they get out, go around, and figure out more things to do now that they have their exit to get out of here. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful, and blessed day. Until next time.